Welcome back to this series on David Ricardo's theory of value. So far, we've recounted Ricardo's argument that the wage and profit rates of each sector tend to be equalized around a general market rate. The force which drives the equalization of profit and wage rates between sectors is the free movement of labor and capital. No equivalent force exists with regard to the rent of land. According to Ricardo's theory of rent, one cannot expect payment for differential plots of land to be equalized. Some plots of land will inherently be more fertile than others, fetching higher prices than less fertile land in perpetuity. This presents a difficulty for Ricardo's theory of value. Since rents don't equalize between sectors, or even between firms within a sector for that matter, what is to stop the prices of commodities whose production requires higher rents from deviating away from proportionality to labor embodied? Although this charge was arguably first brought by Malthus in his own Principles of Political Economy, which was published in 1820, it's been made more recently by Robbins and Stigler, among others. Robbins accuses Ricardo of dodging the issue by eliminating rents from his theory of value. To quote him, he says, "You can just as easily eliminate wages." So in order to evaluate this critique, it's necessary to give an overview of Ricardo's theory of rent. Ricardo defines rent as, quote, "that proportion of the produce of the earth which is paid to the landlord for the original and indestructible powers of the soil." This is not to be confused with the total amount which is paid to a landlord on a given occasion, which is Smith's definition of rent. For Ricardo, it's possible for only a part of a payment to a landlord to constitute rent. The other part could be remuneration for, quote, "the use of the capital employed in ameliorating the quality of the land and in erecting such buildings as were necessary to secure and preserve the produce." Non-rent payments to landlords could also include scarce, non-reproducible goods which happen to reside on the land. Ricardo's notion of rent excludes these. It's not rent in the sense that the word is commonly used, or at least the sense that it's used by Smith. In Ricardo, rent is to be understood as a portion paid for the use of the land itself, not the capital or the produce which lays on the land. Ricardo insists that when fertile land is abundant, there will be no rent. No one will pay rents to a landlord when they can simply wander farther into some frontier and stake their claim to a piece of land which is equally as fertile as the one that's already being used by others. Unfortunately, fertile land can't remain abundant forever. An increasing population brings about an increasing need for agricultural production, giving way to an ever-enlarging expanse of cultivated land. Suppose that population expansion pushes demand for food to a point where less fertile land is the only land available for cultivation. In the moment that the less fertile land is cultivated, the owners of more fertile land are in a position to charge rent. This is because it requires a greater amount of labor to produce on less fertile land than is necessary to produce the same output on more fertile land. The amount of rent which those lucky landlords can charge, to quote Ricardo, will depend on the difference in the quality of the two kinds of land in cultivation. Therefore, owners of fertile land can't price their rent at whatever they like. If they were to charge a greater amount than the difference between the labor costs of producing the same quantity of output on the two different quality lands, capitalists would employ workers on the less fertile land instead. The first instance of rent emerges here due to the fact that, to quote Ricardo, land is not unlimited in quantity and uniform in quality, and because, in the progress of population, land of an inferior quality is called into cultivation. This same principle applies when land of the second quality has all been cultivated and is no longer abundant. Population expansion will bring a third kind of land into cultivation. This kind is even less fertile than the first two kinds already in cultivation. The cost of production on this land is even greater than that of the last two. The labor employed on this third land must be of a greater quantity in order to produce the same amount of food as is purchased on the second land. and still more than that of the most productive land. For the same reasons that the owners of the most productive land can charge rent when the second most productive enters cultivation, the owners of the second most productive land can charge a rent when the third most productive is entered into cultivation. The cultivation of a third quality of land leaves the landlord of the first and most fertile land still better off yet than he was when only two kinds of land were in use. His rents will increase by an amount equivalent to the rent received by the proprietor of the second best quality of land. Ricardo summarizes this situation we've been describing like this, quote, "With every step in the progress of population, which shall oblige a country to have recourse to a land of worse quality to enable it to raise its supply of food, rent on all the more fertile land will rise." This is why Ricardo posits that landlords' share of the national income will have a tendency to increase over time. The increasing distribution of income to landlords as population expands shows us an interesting fact about the price of food, or corn, which itself has an important impact on distribution. An adherent of Adam Smith's adding up theory may assume that increased rent is the cause of increased corn prices. But Ricardo shows that this is not the case. Conversely, Ricardo says, quote, "Corn is not high because a rent is paid, but a rent is paid because corn is high." Only an increase in the payment to labor on the least productive land in cultivation allows rent to exist, and only in the proportion of that increased payment. Therefore, an increase in rent is indicative of an increase in the price of corn, not the other way around. The proportion of an economy's revenue which is not distributed to landlords as rents are distributed to capitalists as profits and laborers as wages. As a larger share of an economy's revenue is distributed to landlords, less is distributed to laborers and capitalists. This is a topic we'll return to at a different time when we discuss more about Ricardo's theory of distribution. Now, let us return to the question of how differential rent factors into Ricardo's theory of value. In the case where the land freely available for cultivation is as fertile as the land presently in use, one can expect that there will be no rent payments necessary, and subsequently, no reason to consider how differences in rent costs may affect the relative prices of commodities. However, as soon as cultivation begins on a plot of land which is less fertile than those already in use, rent must be paid to the owners of all but the landlord of the least fertile land. That's the one, of course, that just entered into use. Only the capitalist operating at the no-rent margin of cultivation escapes this misfortune. What then is the impact of this phenomenon on relative prices? Are those firms incurring higher rent costs in the process of production free to charge higher prices for their output than firms producing on the no-rent margin? Are they free to invalidate the labor-embodied theory of value? If they try, they'll find themselves unable to do so. Firms who attempt to pass their uniquely high rent costs onto consumers in the form of higher prices will fetch no buyers. Firms producing on more fertile land will be forced to sell their output at the same price as firms producing on the least fertile land in cultivation. Instead of passing on rent costs to consumers, businesses operating on more fertile land will be forced to reduce their rate of profit to that which is typical of those operating at the no rent margin. The size of their rent will be determined by the difference in productivity between the land they're using and the least fertile land in cultivation. If landlords try to charge more rent than is necessary to account for differences in labor productivity between plots of soil they own and the least fertile plots, their tenants will flee due to lower than typical profit rates. If landlords charge less rent than necessary to account for such differences, spikes in capital flows will commence, continuing until the rent of the land in question is bid upwards sufficiently. It is clear then that Ricardo's theory of rent does not invalidate his theory of value. Differences in the amount of rent paid out in the production of commodities does not occasion price-value deviations. The relative prices of all commodities whose expanded reproduction requires the use of less favorable land are governed by the same conditions of production, that is, those on the no-rent margin of cultivation. The payment for rent on land more fertile than that on the no-rent margin merely fills the differences in wage costs between those on a less fertile plot of land and the least fertile one. This framework that Ricardo uses to integrate the fact of differential rents into the labor-embodied theory of value can also be used to integrate differences in ability into the labor-embodied theory of value. That's what we're going to discuss in the next episode. If you're a graduate student or a professor studying economics, particularly history of economic thought, and you have some interesting work you'd be willing to share with me, I'd like to speak with you. Please reach out to me by filling out the form linked in the description of this episode. If you're studying economics at the undergraduate or high school level and you're in need of a tutor, I may be able to help you. You can get in contact with me by filling out that same form. If you'd like to see more content like this, where I discuss various topics in the history of economic thought, please consider checking out my YouTube channel. See you in the next episode.